From Hurricane Sandy to a deadly meningitis outbreak, two crises affecting the United States are shining the spotlight on Mitt Romney's attitude to the role of government. You're watching Inside Story US 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihan Brutansi. Millions across the northeastern United States are still being affected by Sandy, the huge storm which has killed 40 people, flooded large areas, and caused billions of dollars worth of damage over several states. Clearly, an efficient response is of paramount importance. And with just 6 days to go before the US election, there's a great deal of scrutiny on President Barack Obama and the body in charge of disaster response, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. But questions have now been raised over how the recovery might progress under a Mitt Romney presidency. The Republican candidate is refusing to acknowledge comments he made during the Republican primaries, which suggest he favors privatizing FEMA.
Absolutely. Every time you have an occasion to take something from the federal government and send it back to the states, that's the right direction. And if you can go even further and send it back to the private sector, that's even better. Instead of thinking in the federal budget, what we should cut, we should ask ourselves the opposite question. What should we keep? We should take all of what we're doing at the federal level and say, what are the things we're doing that we don't have to do? And those things we've got to stop doing because we're borrowing $1.6 trillion more this year than we're taking in.
Including disaster relief.
We cannot afford to do those things without jeopardizing the future for our kids. It is simply immoral, in my view, for us to continue to rack up larger and larger debts and pass them on to our kids, knowing full well that we'll all be dead and gone before it's paid off. Makes no sense at all.
It's not the only crisis highlighting Mitt Romney's political ideology. He's also accused of indirect responsibility for a deadly meningitis outbreak. The disease has been traced back to a Massachusetts company which was allowed to escape regulation while Romney was governor of the state. We'll hear from a lawyer for the meningitis victims later in the program. So, is Mitt Romney the right man for a crisis? With me to discuss this from New York, Craig Unger, writer at Salon.com and author of Boss Rove, Inside Karl Rove's Secret Kingdom of Power. Here in the studio, Ryan Grimm, the Washington bureau chief for the Huffington Post, and next to him, Trevor Boris, a legal associate at the Cato Institute. Ryan, you were the one who actually helped us uncover this soundbite from the primaries. Is it clear what Romney meant?
Well, it's clear what he meant, but we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean when we say that Romney means something? You know, since he entered politics in 1994, he has taken whatever political position is advantageous at that moment. He ran to the left of Ted Kennedy in 94, went moderate in 02, went far right starting in 06, 07, up until now, and then he pivoted, to a more moderate. So what does it mean when you say that he meant what he said? It almost is a phrase without its own meaning. But what I think you can derive from it is that Romney will do what is politically advantageous. So that means in order to know what a President Romney would do, you have to be able to predict what the political winds would be suggesting in the future, whether it's 2013, 14, 15, or 16, and I don't feel comfortable being able to do that. Now, I think you can say that the general electorate is much more moderate than the Republican primary electorate. So a President Romney would definitely be much more moderate when it comes to FEMA. So
well, we don't know, and I suppose that's why this issue has become so interesting because, again, just less than a week before the election, it's very difficult to know specifically what his policies would be, Romney's policies. So we're looking for some fundamental political ideology.
Right, but you're starting from the assumption that he has some fundamental.
Well, we got this to go on. So, that's why. He was asked several times to clarify that statement, and he refused to acknowledge it. Here's some examples of that, actually.
Governor, are you going
Actually, I think in the end, the MSNBC, who collated that, actually counted a few more instances even after that. Trevor Burrus, I mean, again, if we're looking for an underlying principle, which he wasn't then very keen to express there, though, we can see something something clear, isn't it? That it's basically that principle that you slash the federal budget, first of all. Then you give a set amount, a reduced amount, but a set amount to the states, who then creatively manage that money and allocate money to, and figure out their own priorities. In Mitt Romney's world, then preferably by outsourcing to private enterprise. I mean, that is basically, is that what we're looking for here? Is that what he was suggesting he believed in fundamentally in if he was to become president?
I think that is probably accurate, but again, like Ryan, I'm not going to put any money on what Mitt Romney believes. I think he reminds me of Bill Clinton. He's not as natural a politician, but Bill Clinton was always very attuned to the political winds, and he has demonstrated that throughout his entire career. So I think it's kind of, I scratch my head when people call Mitt Romney an extremist, because he's really not an extremist. He did what he had to do in the Republican primaries, but really he's just a politician looking to play the base.
Right.
And I think while it's difficult to figure out what he believes as a person, as a politician, you can divine something from his business record. And so for decades he was basically a corporate raider, and you can take from that what the way that he views society, government's role in society. To him, government's role in society was to help businesses in order to help private equity take over a business, take over their pension obligations, use legal means to break unions, and otherwise use the levers of government power to benefit the very richest. So
this principle, again, as we're trying to cling on to something solid, I mean, apparently the Medicare plans, or the Medicaid plans, rather, the medical safety net. I mean, that's a very similar principle as I just outlined there. So, I mean, that's why we're wondering what he'll do. Craig Unger, is it clear, for example, if those principles were used in the context of Hurricane Sandy and the aftermath, how that would work if everything had been farmed out to states, and then states having already allocated emergency responses, what that would actually mean in real terms right now?
I don't think it's clear at all. I don't know how that would operate. I think it's interesting to look back and see how the Republicans did it under the Bush-Cheney regime, famously with Hurricane Katrina. And at that time, FEMA became an enormous slush fund for patronage. And Karl Rove was put in charge of it for a brief period of time. He had tens and tens of billions of dollars that went to Bechtel and Halliburton. And in addition, when I finally found Karl Rove operatives who were willing to talk to me, I asked, Rove said, well, they don't work for me. And in fact, where did they get their money from? They got their money from FEMA contracts that were doled out to them.
Right.
And these are contracts that be given out with very little oversight, so they're given out on the spur of the moment.
Right. Again, but Trevor Burrus, I mean, Mitt Romney's argument, though, would be, well, yes, but the free market will somehow ensure efficiency under a system like this where things are being farmed out.
I do think that's true to some extent. I'm not a big fan of FEMA, but I think it's interesting because Mr. Unger, he pointed out one of the problems with FEMA, which is that it becomes a political patronage game, and we have data based on presidential elections, and it's more likely for presidents to give FEMA funds to battleground states in election years. That was true of Bush in 2004. That was true of his dad in 92. It was true of Clinton in 96. So it is politicized.
Right, but in the event, I mean, if this was completely handled locally, Ryan Grimm, wouldn't there be a great deal of potential for cronyism handled by state governors and so forth?
Sure. I mean, the potential for corruption would be immense if you just dumped a couple $2 billion on local authorities and allowed them to dispense it. I think probably a better idea to solve the swing state corruption is just to get rid of the Electoral College. Then you don't have these few thousand votes in this one town able to, in some Ohio counties, swinging the election one way or another. If it's just a general election where the popular vote winner wins, then you don't have this incentive.
But in the meantime, though, as far as when something like Sandy hits there, I mean, how efficient is FEMA as a tool, as a resource for states to count upon, as opposed to having some kind of coordinating committee amongst different governors who are supposed to help each other, and having assumed that governors will have, or state senates or whatever, state congresses, will have put aside that money for disaster management, given how cash-strapped they already are?
Not very. I mean, in my opinion, that it suffers from everything you expect from a political bureaucracy, and it has problems of getting information on the ground. I mean, a situation like Sandy, like Katrina, it's kind of like a battlefield situation. There's a fog of war. You don't really know what's going on the ground. And the best commanders always relied on their generals, and FEMA just sort of doesn't really do that. FEMA kind of comes from the top and doesn't really know where to put things.
Right, but if states are completely responsible for this tranche of money and they're terribly cash-strapped, are they really going to be putting money, Ryan, into disaster management for some time in the future, or are they going to be not doing that because they've got such desperate needs in education and policing and homelessness?
Right, and I think you have different kinds of corruption going on. If you dump a couple $2 billion on Mississippi after a flood, I think the chances are very good that the local politicians there are going to dole that money out to their friends rather than to the neediest places. Now, the federal level has different kinds of corruption, which Craig talked about well, where you have the higher level ones where you're shoveling money to Bechtel or Halliburton or Rove cronies. But if it's more properly run, then the federal government can come in and actually crack down and say, look, stop this petty corruption, right. Stop ripping people off, and have a little bit more authority.
Well, I think it's wrong to think the states have no role right now. And you have a governor like Bob Riley in Alabama who would go directly to Karl Rove and make sure the FEMA funds did get dispersed to local, much smaller contractors than Bechtel and so forth. And those are the people who became Rove operatives. They were cronies of the governor of Alabama.
Yeah, but Craig, I mean, is your conclusion then? Well, therefore, FEMA is a tainted organisation. Federal involvement in these issues is fundamentally tainted, or is it simply to reform FEMA and reform the way this money, this desperately needed to be safeguarded money, is doled out and kept in case of emergency?
No, I don't think the answer is to privatize it or give too much more to the states. I think you need a federal response in some cases. And it's very difficult to have oversight of contracts in an emergency when something needs to be given out immediately. But FEMA there should be oversight, at least in the aftermath, so that politicians don't get away with this.
But I do want to point out, we should acknowledge how much the private industry does help out these places. Walmart carted massive amounts of water into Katrina. They had 60% of their stores open within 48 hours of the storm.
There's no role for the private sector, I suppose. But I guess, again, we're looking for the ideological roots of the current Republican Party in some ways. And clearly there is that principle, which certainly Mitt Romney thought was a winner during the primaries, that the states run things better than federal agencies, which I think is something...
I'm not sure that's necessarily true.
Well, that seems to be something that the Republican Party seems to be ascribing to right now. And that then links to this other crisis we're seeing now, the meningitis issue. Congressional report released this week saying that state boards simply don't have the resources to regulate specialty pharmacies that produce drugs in different states, partly perhaps because, especially if they're given block grants and so forth, I mean, there's just not enough money out there, really, and then they have to figure out what their priorities are, and this probably isn't high up in their priorities. Now, we have this meningitis outbreak. Let's give you some more details about that. There was an initial report on September the 21st. Now there have been 356 cases since of fungal meningitis reported in 18 states. So far, 28 people have died. The problem has been traced to an ingredient in an epidural steroid that was made at the New England Compounding Center in Massachusetts. The NECC has now suspended operations and remains under investigation by the CDC, the FDA, and state entities. But it's emerged that the NECC had been cited repeatedly for failing to meet regulatory standards over several years, including under the watch of then-Governor Mitt Romney. But Romney allowed the company to carry on operating and regulate itself. And we spoke to Alison Oliver. She's a lawyer for some of the victims of the outbreak. I asked her what had gone so wrong.
The company that put out this drug was cited 6 times in a three-year time period. And despite this 6 complaints against it, they weren't put out of business. They didn't have to stop business as usual. They were able to continue to manufacture all the drugs that they had previously manufactured, including this drug that's in question here today. They had received a complaint about that drug during that time period about problems with the manufacturing process. Like I said, despite all of those alerts, what we ended up with was a company that was able to stay in business and continue to manufacture the very same drug that, has caused hundreds of illnesses, 25 deaths at this point, and thousands of people. My clients worrying about, are they going to get sick tomorrow? I mean, they're worried to death, and this should have and could have been prevented.
So faced with these complaints, authorities offered the laboratory a deal. What did that deal consist of?
They offered to, and it was agreed to by the government, that they being the company, was going to pay for their own, essentially, probation officer, an outside third-party company that was going to come in and, audit the manufacturing process and report apparently to the government if something was out of place.
Is it clear why Mitt Romney and those he appointed to oversee this company were so reluctant to take action?
Well, I mean, it seems to me that during this time period that we're talking about, this was a time period in which, Governor Romney at the time was overseeing these agencies. This agency that we're talking about, the board was appointed by him directly. And, from looking through the documents and reading through the transcripts and looking at, all of the evidence that we've been able to accumulate to date, it looks like this board was, in effect, dishing out, the policy that we now know that Governor Romney would bring forth, should he become president, and that is kind of a hands-off approach to business, and effort to allow business to essentially govern itself. I mean, one of the quotes, and I wrote it down because I didn't want to get it wrong, is from Governor Romney, is that the right way to deal with health care is not by applying more government controls, but by making it a consumer-driven market. And, it looks like, from looking at what happened during this time period, that, this is exactly the sort of approach that the board gave to this company who had received 6 complaints.
But how much responsibility does Mitt Romney bear for this outbreak, would you say?
Well, I mean, I think he bears responsibility for dealing with his agencies in an appropriate manner. I mean, this, again, it happened several years ago, but, had the agency at the time taken the appropriate step and not allowed a 6-time offender, to conduct business as usual, not allow a lawyer to say, what, if you put my company out of business, we're not going to agree to what you want. To not allow this to happen, that's what should have happened, at the time. At the end of the day, leadership is responsible for what happens under their watch. So in that regard, I would say that Governor Romney is responsible for, what's taken place since then that's resulted in, thousands of people being injured. These people are going to have to deal with this problem even after the election is over. This case is going to go forward, no matter what happens politically. So, this is affected. This is a horrifying. I can't even describe to you how scared and hurt these people are. And this, it's not a political issue. It's a regulatory issue.
Alison Oliver, but of course, Ryan Grimm, regulation is a political issue. And you've often said, Ryan, we can't necessarily take what Mitt Romney says on the campaign trail as what he believes in, but it is instructive to see what his record was as governor. Presumably then here, he thought that market forces would take care of this, that no company would voluntarily take the risk of being shut down or being sued by continuing with shoddy practices. Clearly that didn't happen here, though. Right,
and I don't want to take the argument too far. Clearly he subscribes to a basic philosophy, a conservative philosophy that says power should devolve from the federal government down to the states. And they don't say that because they think that states will do a better job of regulating other industries or a better job of carrying out the functions of government. They argue for that position because they think the states will do less of it. They want less government. And they got less government when it came to this pharmaceutical plant, and we saw what the consequences were.
Trevor Burrus,
Well, I think that this is a good example of how it is pretty dangerous to have the government involved in approving drugs, and it may sound absurd that I'm saying that, but what regulation does is, because it puts a rubber stamp on things, either at the state level or the federal level, lacks nuance in between it. So the old joke is, what do you call the guy who finished last in medical school? you call him doctor, because it levels everything because he's licensed, and so the state says he has a license, so he's as good as everyone else, essentially. If you destroy that by putting one regulation down.
So what's the alternative?
Sorry?
What's the alternative?
Well, the alternative is private regulation via essentially quality control organizations, which would arise and do arise and have arose.
After people are dead.
Oh, no, the very important to point out that we have this political issue, which is that we can guarantee that some people will die just with statistical certainty about certain things. There's a fail rate, there will be 10% of this or whatever, so there's no perfection here. We need to have better access to drugs, better production of drugs, and a lot of these being hampered on the front end by drug regulation.
Craig Unger, what do you make of all this?
Well, to me, it ties in very closely with the FEMA issue and the hurricane we're going through, in that both issues have to do with the role of the government in protecting its citizens. And here, I think this is precisely where government should intervene. And we saw under Romney, the offenders in question got off with a hand slap and nothing more. I think it's worth adding that there was a fatality in 2004, and NECC settled a case out of court regarding a different steroid at the time. So we saw even then that this lack of regulation had fatal consequences, and they were still allowed to get off.
It's interesting, though, that the president of the New England Compounding Company is a major political donor, it turns out now. He's given generously to Senator Scott Brown in his race in Massachusetts right now. And Scott Brown was one of 10 senators in July who wrote a letter to the Drug Enforcement Agency asking for a reduction in regulations on pharmaceutical compounding, the process that happens here. I mean, that's another element of all this as well, beyond ideology, I suppose, Ryan. Actually, Craig, I'll ask you, because you've written about this a bit as well. I don't know whether you've had a chance to look. We know that the head of this New England company has donated to the Romney presidential campaign, but do we know if he was a donor to Mitt Romney when he was governor as well?
My understanding is there was a $2,500 donation. I would have to double check to make sure.
But that was the presidential campaign.
That was during the presidential.
Yeah.
Yes.
I guess it's something to dig into, I suppose. Where we're trying to figure out what belief is and what pragmatism is and what frankly political cronyism is.
Well, yes. And as I said, we're going to have people die of adverse drug reactions in all situations. The point of lessening the regulation is so we have less of what's called a type 2 error, which is like people not getting the drugs that they need. And so right now, many economists will tell you that the biggest cost of drug regulation at the federal level and at the state level is a 2-year delay, a 3-year delay before a drug gets on the market, not allowing the patient to choose their risk level of saying, well, you have a 20% chance risk of getting this, and they say, well, I want to take that risk. The FDA has all or nothing, and they say no, and that's a huge cost. These are people who could be dead before they can even get the drug.
Ryan Grimm?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can debate within that context how much how much time it ought to take the FDA to bring things to market, and I think Trevor's right too that it's almost worse to have bad and corrupt regulation than it is to have no regulation.
But surely what we've seen in Massachusetts.
That's bad and corrupt, right?
Exactly.
And because then people think, oh, well, this is regulated,
right?
But
doesn't that mean we need to rationalize and enhance regulation?
That's what I would say.
Yes, but the incentives
with sufficient watchdog and powers and so forth.
The incentives aren't there for. I mean, we can understand why the FDA makes type 1 errors, which are preventing harm, and doesn't make many type 2 errors, because type 1 errors are politically difficult. Because it's very easy to put, as we're doing right here, to put people who were harmed by drugs on the air. We can't put the people who didn't get the drugs on the air. So we would expect them, just if we were running an analysis of their decision making, to make more type 1 errors than type 2.
Final word.
Yeah. This is slightly different than testing a drug that's new to the marketplace. In this case, there were at least 6 citations of NECC, and they got off with a slap of the wrist. So they were caught, but
so the regulation did work.
The Commission allowed them.
Yeah.
They would have worked if they were enforced.
Right. Well, we'll have to leave it there. The search for what Mitt Romney really believes goes on, I guess. Craig Unger, thank you very much. Ryan Grimm, thank you. Trevor Burrus, thank you. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.